$20. That's all it took to uncover a secret buried for over a century. A secret that would transform Jake Morrison from a broken-down cowboy into the richest man in 3 counties. But money, as Jake would soon discover, comes with a price that some souls aren't prepared to pay. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape of the Morrison Ranch, illuminating nothing but cracked earth and withered dreams. Jake Morrison stood on his collapsing porch, his weathered hands gripping a foreclosure notice that felt heavier than any saddle he'd ever carried. 63 years old, with more dust in his lungs than hope in his heart, Jake had spent his entire life working land that seemed determined to defeat him. The ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations was dying. The wells had run dry 3 summers ago, the cattle had been sold off one by one to pay mounting debts, and now even the vultures seemed to have given up circling overhead. All that remained was Jake, his 19-year-old daughter Emma, and 47 acres of stubborn Texas soil that refused to yield anything but heartache. Emma emerged from the house, her auburn hair catching the morning light like spun copper. She was supposed to start college next month, had even received a partial scholarship, but the acceptance letter now served as a bookmark in her father's worn Bible, a reminder of dreams deferred by harsh reality. "Dad, Mr. Henderson's here," she said softly, nodding toward the black SUV kicking up dust clouds as it approached down their dirt road. Charles Henderson, the banker who held their fate in his manicured hands, the man who'd been circling their property like a well-dressed hawk, waiting for the inevitable moment when the Morrisons would have no choice but to sell to his development company for a fraction of what the land was worth. Jake watched the SUV pull up, its pristine exterior a stark contrast to the rust and decay that seemed to define everything else on the Morrison property. Henderson stepped out, his city shoes immediately gathering dust, his expression a careful mask of manufactured sympathy. "Jake, Emma," Henderson nodded, his voice carrying the tone of a man who delivered bad news so many times it had become routine. "I trust you've had time to consider our offer." The offer, $30,000 for land that had housed 4 generations of Morrison blood, sweat, and tears. It was insulting, but it was also the only lifeline they had. Jake felt Emma's hand slip into his, her fingers trembling slightly. At 19, she shouldn't have to watch her father's legacy crumble. She should be preparing for freshman orientation, not standing in the dust of a failing ranch, witnessing the end of everything their family had built. "I need more time, Henderson," Jake said, his voice rougher than usual. Henderson checked his gold watch, a gesture Jake had seen a dozen times before. "Jake, we've been dancing around this for months. The bank needs an answer by Friday or we'll have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure proceedings. Friday, 3 days to find a miracle, or lose everything." As Henderson drove away, leaving behind only dust and the echo of an ultimatum, Jake felt the weight of failure settling on his shoulders like a yoke he'd carried too long. He'd survived droughts, market crashes, and the death of his beloved wife Sarah 5 years ago. But this felt different. This felt like the end. Emma squeezed his hand tighter. "We'll figure something out, Dad. We always do." But as Jake looked across the barren landscape that had been his whole world, he couldn't shake the feeling that some problems were too big for hope and too deep for prayer. The Morrison name had weathered many storms on this land, but every storm eventually passes, and when the clouds clear, sometimes all you find is devastation. What Jake didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that in less than 24 hours a $20 bill and his daughter's curiosity would unlock a mystery that had been sleeping beneath their feet for over a century. A mystery that would prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places we least expect to find them. Sometimes the land gives back. Before we dive deeper into Jake's incredible story, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the tale you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about luck, destiny, and the secrets that lie buried beneath our feet. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Jake Morrison wasn't born to be a failure, but life had a way of wearing down even the strongest men. The ranch he now struggled to keep had once been a thriving operation, back when his grandfather struck oil in the 1940s and made the Morrison name synonymous with prosperity in Millerville County. But oil wells dry up, markets crash, and dreams have a way of turning to dust when you're not watching closely enough. The decline hadn't been sudden. It never is with family legacies. It started small, with missed payments during a particularly harsh winter, then snowballed through a series of unfortunate events that seemed almost biblical in their persistence. First, the oil dried up just as Jake took over the ranch from his father. Then came the drought that lasted 3 years, killing off most of their cattle and leaving the pastures looking like a moonscape. Sarah's cancer treatment had drained their savings, and even after she lost that battle, the medical bills kept coming like ghosts demanding payment. Jake's days now followed a monotonous routine that spoke to his quiet desperation. He'd wake before dawn, not because there was much work to do, but because sleep had become elusive in recent months. The coffee was always too weak. They'd started buying the cheap stuff to save money, and the breakfast was usually whatever Emma could create from the dwindling supplies in their pantry. By 6 a.m., he'd be outside, checking on the 3 remaining horses they couldn't afford to feed properly, walking the fence lines of property he might lose by week's end, and pretending there was still purpose in the ritual of ranching when there was hardly any ranch left to run. His hands, once steady enough to rope a calf at full gallop, now trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. A combination of age, stress, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. Emma had become his anchor in ways that made him both proud and heartbroken. She'd deferred college twice now, working part-time at the diner in town to help with expenses, never complaining even though he could see the dreams flickering in her eyes like candles in the wind. She had her mother's intelligence and her grandfather's stubborn optimism, but Jake feared those qualities would be wasted on a ranch that seemed determined to drag down anyone foolish enough to love it. The girl deserved better than watching her father's dignity crumble one foreclosure notice at a time. She deserved freshman orientation and sorority meetings, and the kind of bright future that seemed to exist everywhere except on the Morrison Ranch. But Emma remained loyal with the fierce devotion that ran in their bloodline, even when loyalty felt more like a curse than a virtue. Their nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, no relation to the banker, had sold their land to developers 6 months ago and moved to a retirement community in Florida. The Washingtons, who'd run cattle on the adjacent property for 30 years, had declared bankruptcy and moved in with relatives in Dallas. One by one, the families that had defined this corner of Texas were disappearing, leaving behind empty houses and rusted mailboxes like headstones marking the death of a way of life. Jake often wondered if he was being stubborn or stupid, holding on to land that clearly didn't want to be held. Sarah used to say that the ranch was in their blood, that leaving would be like cutting out their hearts. But Sarah was gone now, and hearts didn't pay mortgages. Maybe Henderson was right. Maybe $30,000 and a fresh start somewhere else was better than watching everything crumble in slow motion. But every evening when the sun set over the western pasture and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that no artist could replicate, Jake felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope required more energy than he could muster these days, but it was a stubborn refusal to surrender that had been passed down through 4 generations of Morrison men who'd worked this land. His grandfather used to tell stories about the early days, when the ranch was nothing but raw prairie and impossible dreams, about the first oil strike that turned their modest cattle operation into something legendary, about the way the land seemed to reward those who loved it enough to endure its hardships. Jake had always assumed those stories were embellished by time and whiskey, the way old men's tales usually were. But lately, especially in the quiet hours before dawn when the world felt suspended between night and day, Jake found himself wondering if there might be more to his grandfather's stories than he'd given credit for. The old man had always insisted that the ranch held secrets, that the Morrison family had been chosen to be stewards of something special. Jake had dismissed such talk as the romantic nonsense of a man who'd lived too long and remembered too selectively. But now, facing the loss of everything, he found himself almost hoping that his grandfather's mystical view of the land might contain some grain of truth. 3 days until Henderson's deadline. 72 hours to find a miracle or watch 4 generations of Morrison history disappear into the portfolio of a development company that would probably turn their heritage into a strip mall. As Jake stood on his porch that evening watching Emma walk back from feeding the horses, he whispered a prayer to whatever forces might be listening. He didn't ask for wealth or even success, just for a sign that holding on wasn't the foolish pride of a broken-down cowboy who didn't know when to quit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new reminders of how close they were to losing everything. But tonight, with the Texas sky stretching endlessly overhead, Jake Morrison allowed himself to believe that sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when you're brave enough to keep faith with the land that raised you. The sound started at 3:17 a.m., according to the old alarm clock on Jake's nightstand, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass, emanating from somewhere beneath the house. Jake lay still for several minutes, convincing himself it was just the old pipe settling or maybe a raccoon in the crawl space, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Emma appeared in his doorway, her silhouette backlit by the hallway light she'd apparently turned on to investigate the noise herself. "Dad, do you hear that?" Jake sat up, his joints protesting after another restless night. Probably just the old plumbing acting up again. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The tapping had a quality that made the hair on his arms stand up, a cadence that seemed almost like Morse code, though Jake had never learned to decipher such things. It continued for exactly 7 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the sound itself. Neither of them slept well for the remainder of the night. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Jake spent an hour crawling around under the house with a flashlight, checking pipes and foundation stones, finding nothing that could explain the mysterious tapping. The crawl space smelled of dust and decades of neglect, but there were no signs of animal intrusion, no loose pipes, no obvious source for the sounds that had disturbed their sleep. Emma made coffee while Jake examined the basement, though basement was a generous term for the small root cellar his great-grandfather had carved out of the earth beneath the kitchen. The space was cramped and musty, filled with empty mason jars and forgotten remnants of more prosperous times. Jake had been down here countless times over the years, but this morning, something felt different. The dirt floor, which had always been level and unremarkable, now showed signs of subtle disturbance. Not obvious digging, but rather small depressions and raised areas that suggested the earth beneath had somehow shifted during the night. Jake ran his hands over the packed soil, feeling variations in texture that definitely hadn't been there before. "Find anything?" Emma's voice drifted down from the kitchen above. "Maybe," Jake called back, though he wasn't sure what he'd found, only that something had changed. That afternoon, while Emma worked her shift at the diner, Jake found himself drawn back to the root cellar. The mysterious tapping had occurred 3 more times throughout the day, always the same pattern, always lasting exactly 7 minutes. Each time, Jake had rushed to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the earth itself was trying to communicate. Armed with a small garden spade and his grandfather's old mining lamp, a relic from the early oil prospecting days, Jake began to carefully excavate one of the raised areas in the cellar floor. The soil came away easily, almost eagerly, as if it wanted to give up whatever secrets it held. 2 feet down, his spade struck something that definitely wasn't dirt or rock. The metallic clink echoed in the small space, and Jake's pulse quickened. Working more carefully now, he began to uncover what appeared to be a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox but considerably heavier. The container was old. That much was obvious from the patina and corrosion that covered its surface, but it had been wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas, which had protected it from the worst ravages of time and moisture. Jake's hands trembled as he lifted it from its earthen grave, noting the weight suggested it contained something substantial. The box bore no markings or identifying features, just the honest wear of age and concealment. A simple metal latch held it closed, though the mechanism moved freely despite decades underground. Jake hesitated, suddenly aware that some discoveries change everything, and there's no going back once certain doors are opened. He thought of Emma, working at the diner for tips that barely covered their grocery bills. He thought of Henderson's ultimatum, now just 2 days away. He thought of his grandfather's stories about the ranch holding secrets worth more than oil or cattle. Jake opened the box. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled leather, were documents. Old documents, written in his great-grandfather's careful handwriting, along with what looked like official papers bearing government seals from the 1880s. But it was what lay beneath the papers that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Gold coins. Dozens of them, each one heavy with the promise of authenticity. They bore dates from the late 1800s, and even Jake's untrained eye could tell they weren't replicas or novelties. These were the real thing, genuine American gold eagles that had been hidden away for over a century. But there was something else in the box, something that made the gold coins seem almost incidental. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his great-grandfather's meticulous handwriting, detailing not just the location of this particular cache, but references to other hiding places scattered across the property, references to a treasure that made the ranch's old oil strike look like pocket change. As Jake read the first few pages by lamplight, the tapping sound began again. But now he understood it wasn't random. It was a signal, a call to attention that had been programmed into the very foundations of the house. His great-grandfather, it seemed, had been more than just a fortunate oil prospector. He'd been the keeper of a secret that dated back to the days when Texas was still finding its identity, when fortunes were made and lost in the space between sunup and sundown. The journal's first entry was dated November 15, 1889, and began with words that sent chills down Jake's spine. To my descendants who find this record, what lies beneath the Morrison land is not ours by right of ownership, but by covenant of stewardship. We are guardians of something far greater than gold or oil. We are protectors of a legacy that will test the worthiness of every generation that follows. Jake carefully closed the journal and looked around the cramped cellar with new eyes. The tapping had stopped, but he could swear he felt the earth beneath his feet humming with anticipation, as if it had been waiting over a century for this moment. 2 days until Henderson's deadline. But Jake Morrison had just discovered that some deadlines matter less than others when you're sitting on top of a secret that could rewrite history. Jake spent the entire night reading his great-grandfather's journal by lamplight, afraid to bring such explosive secrets into the main house where Emma might stumble upon them. The leather-bound book contained detailed maps of the property, marked with cryptic symbols and coordinates that corresponded to locations Jake knew by heart, but had never seen with the eyes of a treasure hunter. According to the journal, his great-grandfather Josiah Morrison hadn't simply been lucky with oil. He'd been entrusted with something far more valuable. The entry spoke of a wagon train that had passed through their land in 1887, carrying a fortune in gold and silver that had been redistributed from those who stole it to those who would protect it. Josiah had apparently been chosen as a guardian, tasked with keeping the treasure safe until the time of great need arrived. The journal contained meticulous records of hiding places scattered across the 47 acres, each marked with natural landmarks that had endured for over a century. The old oak tree by the eastern fence, the rock formation near what was now the barn, the dried creek bed that meandered through the southern pasture. According to Josiah's careful documentation, each location held caches of varying sizes, all part of a larger fortune that had been systematically hidden across the Morrison land. But the journal also contained warnings. Josiah wrote extensively about the burden of stewardship and the dangers that came with such knowledge. He mentioned other families who had been entrusted with similar responsibilities, and the various fates that had befallen those who proved unworthy of their trust. Some had died in mysterious accidents. Others had simply vanished along with their portions of the treasure. The most chilling entry was dated December 1st, 1889. The gold calls to men's souls in ways that change them. I have seen good men become monsters when they glimpse what lies beneath our feet. Emma's great-great-grandmother will need to choose her successor carefully, for this burden is not inherited by blood alone, but by character. When Emma returned from her morning shift at the diner, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a single gold coin as if it might disappear if he looked away. His eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night, and he had the expression of a man who'd seen something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "Dad, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake looked up at his daughter, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Emma had her great-great-grandmother's eyes, the same intelligence and moral clarity that had apparently been passed down through 5 generations of Morrison women. According to the journal, the female line had always been the true guardians of the family's secrets, the ones who decided when the time was right to reveal what lay hidden. "Emma, sit down. I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible." As Jake recounted his discovery, Emma's expression shifted from concern to disbelief to wonder. He showed her the coin, the journal, and finally led her down to the root cellar, where the mysterious tapping had revealed the first cache. Emma held the leather-bound book with reverence, immediately understanding that she was holding more than family history. She was holding responsibility. "Dad, this is..." She paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "This is life-changing." "That's what I'm afraid of," Jake replied. They spent the morning using Josiah's maps to locate the first 3 hiding spots. At each location, exactly as the journal predicted, they found carefully concealed caches containing gold coins, silver bars, and precious stones that had been protected from the elements by the same oiled canvas and leather wrapping techniques Josiah had used in the root cellar. By noon they had uncovered enough treasure to pay off their debts 10 times over, buy back all the neighboring properties, and still have enough left to secure Emma's college education and Jake's retirement. But with each discovery, Jake felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the physical effort of digging. The journal had been explicit about the dangers of revealing the treasure's existence too quickly or carelessly. Josiah wrote about the importance of maintaining the family's humble appearance, of never displaying wealth in ways that would attract unwanted attention. He emphasized that the treasure was meant to be used wisely, in service of something greater than personal comfort. Their contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. Through the kitchen window, they watched Charles Henderson's black SUV pull into their driveway, a day earlier than his deadline demanded. But Henderson wasn't alone this time. He was accompanied by two men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. Emma quickly concealed the journal while Jake washed the dirt from his hands, both of them trying to appear normal despite the earth-shaking discovery they'd just made. But normalcy felt like a costume that no longer fit properly. Henderson's knock on the door carried an urgency that hadn't been there during his previous visits. "Jake, I need to speak with you. It's important." When Jake opened the door, Henderson's usual veneer of polite professionalism had been replaced by something harder, more desperate. "Jake, I'm going to be direct with you. My associates here represent some very powerful interests, and they've made me an offer I can't refuse. We need your land, and we need it immediately." One of Henderson's companions stepped forward, a thin man with cold eyes who introduced himself simply as Mr. Smith. His voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to compliance. "Mr. Morrison, we're prepared to triple our previous offer. $100,000 cash for immediate transfer of the property. No negotiations, no delays." Jake felt Emma's hand slip into his, her fingers conveying a message that needed no words. They had discovered something worth infinitely more than any offer these men could make, but they also sensed that their visitors suspected more than they were revealing. "Why the sudden urgency?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Mr. Smith's smile held no warmth. "Let's just say that certain historical research has come to light regarding this property. Research that suggests your family may have been stewards of something valuable." The word stewards hung in the air like a threat. Somehow, impossibly, these men knew about the treasure, and if they were willing to triple their offer without negotiation, it meant they understood exactly how much the Morrison land was truly worth. Jake realized that his great-grandfather's warnings about the burden of stewardship were about to be tested in ways the old man could never have imagined. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. These men knew. Somehow, impossibly, they had discovered the secret that had been buried with his great-grandfather over 70 years ago. The question was how much they knew, and what they were willing to do to obtain what lay beneath Morrison's soil. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Jake said, but his voice carried none of the authority he'd intended. Fear had a way of stealing strength from even the most determined men. Mr. Smith's cold smile widened. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. We're not simply land developers interested in your property for its surface value. We represent interests that have been tracking the Morrison treasure for decades." Emma stepped closer to her father, and Jake could feel her trembling. The journal she'd hidden was still in the kitchen, but these men's knowledge suggested they had access to information that went far beyond what Josiah had recorded. Henderson looked uncomfortable, as if he'd been dragged into something larger than his original banking business. "Jake, these men have documentation, government records from the 1880s. They know about the wagon train, about what your great-grandfather was entrusted to protect." The second man, who had remained silent until now, opened a leather briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with aged documents. "Mr. Morrison, your ancestor was one of 7 families chosen to safeguard a treasure that was, shall we say, liberated from certain corrupt officials during the territorial period. The gold and silver your great-grandfather hid was never legally his to keep." "That's impossible," Emma said, finding her voice. "Our family has owned this land for over a century." "Owned the land, yes," Mr. Smith replied, "but not what lies beneath it. The treasure belongs to the federal government, and we're here to reclaim it." Jake's mind raced. If these men were government agents, why the secrecy? Why the offers to buy, rather than simply seizing the property through eminent domain? Something about their story didn't align with their methods. "I'd like to see some identification," Jake said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The two men exchanged glances, and in that moment of hesitation, Jake caught a glimpse of something that changed everything. Mr. Smith's jacket had fallen open slightly, revealing not a government badge, but the edge of a tattoo, a symbol that Jake recognized from his grandfather's old stories about the oil fields. His grandfather had warned him about treasure hunters, men who spent their lives chasing rumors and legends, willing to do anything to claim fortunes that didn't belong to them. These weren't federal agents. They were modern-day pirates who had somehow gained access to historical records and were using official-sounding language to legitimize their theft. "Emma, go inside and call Sheriff Martinez," Jake said quietly. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the second man said, his hand moving to his jacket in a gesture that suggested he wasn't carrying government credentials. But Emma was already moving, her youth and agility carrying her toward the house before the men could react. Jake stepped between them and the door, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just their family's fate, but their survival. "The thing is," Jake said, stalling for time, "I've been reading my great-grandfather's journal, and it tells a very different story than the one you're selling." Mr. Smith's expression hardened. "Give us the journal, Morrison, and we might let you and your daughter walk away with enough to start over somewhere else." "Can't do that," Jake replied. "See, according to what I've read, the treasure wasn't stolen from corrupt officials. It was taken from men exactly like you, raiders and thieves who had been preying on honest settlers. My great-grandfather and those other families weren't just guardians. They were heroes." The sound of sirens in the distance suggested that Emma had successfully contacted the sheriff, but Jake could see in the men's faces that they weren't planning to wait for law enforcement to arrive. Mr. Smith reached into his jacket, and Jake knew they had seconds before the situation escalated beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. That's when the tapping started again. The rhythmic sound that had haunted Jake for 2 days suddenly filled the air, but now it wasn't coming from beneath the house. It was everywhere, from the ground, from the barn, from the old oak tree by the eastern fence. The earth itself seemed to be responding to the threat against its guardians. The two men looked around in confusion as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then, impossibly, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. Not an earthquake, but something more focused, more intentional. Henderson backed toward his SUV, his face pale. "What the hell is happening?" Jake felt a strange calm descending over him as he finally understood what his great-grandfather had tried to convey in the journal's most cryptic passages. The treasure wasn't just hidden on Morrison land. It was protected by forces that defied easy explanation. The earth itself had become a guardian, responding to threats against those who had proven themselves worthy stewards. Mr. Smith pulled out what was definitely not a government badge, but before he could use it, the ground beneath his feet gave way. Not a sinkhole, but a controlled subsidence that dropped him waist-deep into earth that had been solid moments before. His companion met the same fate, both men trapped as effectively as if they'd been caught in concrete. Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulled into the driveway just as the tapping stopped, and the ground solidified once again, leaving the two would-be thieves embedded in Morrison soil like unwanted fence posts. Emma emerged from the house carrying the journal, her eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been pride. "Dad, I think great-great-grandfather Josiah left us more than just treasure maps." As the sheriff took the two men into custody on charges of attempted extortion and trespassing, Jake realized that the Morrison family legacy was far more complex and powerful than he'd ever imagined. They weren't just inheritors of hidden wealth. They were part of something that connected the very earth to the people who loved it enough to protect it. The $20 bill that had started this incredible journey was still in Jake's pocket, but it no longer seemed like much money at all. Sometimes the smallest things unlock the greatest mysteries, and sometimes the land gives back in ways that transcend any treasure that can be weighed or counted. Henderson drove away without another word about foreclosure. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood on the same porch where he'd received that foreclosure notice, but everything had changed. Not just the circumstances, though the Morrison ranch was now debt-free and prosperous, but Jake himself had been transformed by the understanding that some inheritances are bigger than money, deeper than blood, and more valuable than anything that can be bought or sold. The treasure, as it turned out, was real. Every location marked in Josiah's journal yielded exactly what the old maps promised. But Jake and Emma had followed the journal's wisdom, revealing only enough wealth to secure their immediate needs and Emma's education. The rest remained safely hidden, protected by whatever mysterious forces had guarded it for over a century. Emma was now enrolled at the State University studying agricultural science and business management, preparing to return to the ranch with the knowledge needed to honor both their family's legacy and the responsibility that came with it. She came home every weekend, drawn by something stronger than homesickness, a connection to the land that grew stronger with each passing month. The strange tapping had stopped after that confrontation with the treasure hunters, but Jake often felt the presence of something watchful and protective when he walked the property at dawn. The earth seemed more alive now, more responsive to his care. The wells that had been dry for 3 years suddenly began producing water again. Grass grew where only dust had been. It was as if the land itself was grateful to finally have guardians who understood their true purpose. Sheriff Martinez had investigated the 2 men who'd tried to steal the treasure, uncovering a network of historical document thieves who had been tracking family legacies across the Southwest for years. Henderson, it turned out, had been pressured into cooperation by threats against his own family. He'd eventually become an ally, helping Jake establish the legal protections needed to ensure the Morrison treasure remained secure. But the most profound change wasn't in their bank account or their property's condition. It was in Jake's understanding of what it meant to be a steward, rather than simply an owner. The journal had taught him that true wealth lay not in what you could take from the land, but in what you could give back to it and to future generations. Jake began hosting workshops for other struggling ranchers, sharing practical knowledge about sustainable agriculture and water conservation, but also something more intangible, the wisdom that comes from understanding your connection to something larger than yourself. He never spoke directly about the treasure, but he helped others discover their own forms of hidden wealth, the value of community, the strength that comes from persistence, and the miracles that reveal themselves to those who refuse to surrender their dreams. On quiet evenings, when the Texas sky painted itself in impossible colors and the first stars appeared over the western pasture, Jake would sit on his porch and read from Josiah's journal. Each page revealed new layers of meaning, new understanding about the responsibility that came with their family's unique inheritance. The $20 bill that had sparked this incredible journey now sat framed on the mantelpiece, not as a symbol of poverty overcome, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest catalyst can unlock the greatest transformations. It served as proof that miracles often disguise themselves as ordinary moments, waiting for someone with enough faith to recognize their true nature. And that brings us to the end of Jake Morrison's incredible story. But before you click away, I want you to think about your own life. What buried treasures might be waiting beneath the surface of your everyday struggles? What family legacies have you overlooked because they didn't come wrapped in obvious wealth? Sometimes the greatest fortunes are hidden in the places we least expect to find them, in the land beneath our feet, in the stories our elders thought no one was listening to, in the small acts of faith we perform when everything seems lost. If Jake's story touched something in your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that hope is never as far away as it seems, and that sometimes the earth itself conspires to help those who refuse to give up on their dreams. Because in the end, we're all guardians of something precious, and the greatest treasure isn't what we find, it's what we choose to protect for those who come after us. Until next time, keep digging. You never know what miracles are waiting just beneath the surface.